It was one of those evenings that seemed almost too quiet, the kind where nothing exciting ever happens. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple before fading into a deep blue. The air was cool, and the hum of crickets could be heard faintly in the distance. Officer Michael Reynolds sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos he'd brought along for his shift. He wasn't new to this job. He'd been on the force for nearly a decade, but tonight felt different somehow. Maybe it was the calmness of the road or the way the stars twinkled above him like tiny reminders that life went on, even when things felt still. Reynolds was stationed just outside Washington, D.C., in a suburban area known more for its quiet neighborhoods than anything dramatic. Most nights were uneventful. A few speeding tickets here, a noise complaint there. But as any officer knows, you never really know what's around the corner. Every traffic stop has the potential to turn into something bigger, which is why Reynolds always stayed alert. You couldn't afford to let your guard down, not if you wanted to make it home safely at the end of your shift. As he drove down Interstate 66, scanning the road ahead, something caught his eye. A black sedan zipped past him at an alarming speed, weaving slightly between lanes as though the driver was either distracted or in a hurry. Reynolds frowned and glanced at his radar gun. Sure enough, the device confirmed what he already suspected. The car was traveling at 85 miles per hour in a 55-mile-per-hour zone. That was reckless driving by anyone's standards, and Reynolds knew he couldn't just ignore it. He flipped on his lights and hit the siren, the piercing wail cutting through the silence of the highway. The black sedan slowed down reluctantly, pulling over onto the shoulder with a sigh of tires against asphalt. Reynolds took a deep breath, mentally preparing himself for whatever might come next. Traffic stops were unpredictable. They always carried a hint of danger, no matter how routine. They seemed. He grabbed his flashlight, stepped out of his car, and approached the vehicle cautiously, his hand resting lightly on the holster of his service weapon. The driver's window rolled down slowly, revealing a man sitting behind the wheel. He looked polished, wearing a crisp suit that spoke of importance and authority. His expression was calm but guarded, as though he wasn't used to being pulled over, or perhaps didn't expect to have to deal with consequences like everyone else. Reynolds nodded politely, keeping his tone professional as he asked for the man's license and registration. "Evening, sir," he said. "Do you know how fast you were going?" The man handed over his documents without hesitation, his movements smooth and deliberate. There was an air of confidence about him, the kind that comes from knowing you're usually in control of every situation. Reynolds glanced at the ID card and froze for a split second. The name on the license read, Christopher Ray. It took him a moment to process what he was seeing. This wasn't just some random motorist speeding home after a long day at work. This was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, one of the most powerful people in law enforcement. For a brief moment, Reynolds felt a flicker of doubt. Was this really happening? Should he handle this differently because of who the driver was? But then he reminded himself of something his training officer had drilled into him years ago. The law applies to everyone, no matter their title or position. If anything, holding someone accountable who held such high office might send a stronger message than ticketing an ordinary citizen. Still, Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that this traffic stop was about to take a turn he hadn't anticipated. He returned to his patrol car, leaving the director waiting silently in his sedan. Sitting behind the wheel, Reynolds reviewed the details of the infraction, jotting notes onto his clipboard. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept wandering. What would happen if word got out that he'd pulled over the FBI director? Would people applaud him for doing his job impartially, or would they criticize him for embarrassing someone so high profile? These thoughts swirled in his head, making the seconds feel longer than they actually were. Back on the highway, the world seemed frozen in time. Cars passed by occasionally, their drivers glancing curiously at the scene unfolding on the shoulder. Some slowed down to get a better look, while others sped up, eager to avoid getting involved. The headlights of Reynolds' patrol car cast long shadows across the pavement, illuminating the tension hanging thick in the air. As he prepared to return to the sedan, Reynolds reminded himself of one simple truth. No matter who sat behind the wheel, he had a duty to uphold the law. And, tonight, that meant finishing what he'd started, no matter the cost. As Officer Michael Reynolds walked back toward the black sedan, his mind raced with a mixture of determination and unease. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He was about to issue a speeding ticket to none other than Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI. It wasn't just any name. It was a title that carried immense authority and influence. For most people, pulling over someone like Wray would feel surreal, almost impossible to process. But Reynolds had always prided himself on being level-headed, even in situations that tested his resolve. He reminded himself that this wasn't personal. It was simply part of the job. When he reached the driver's side window again, Reynolds cleared his throat and spoke calmly, though there was a slight edge to his voice. "Sir," he began, holding up the citation he'd written, "I clocked you going 85 miles per hour in a 55 zone. I'm issuing you a ticket for reckless driving." His tone was firm but respectful, the way he'd been trained to address anyone during a traffic stop. However, instead of accepting the ticket quietly, Wray raised an eyebrow, leaning slightly forward in his seat. "Officer?" Wray said, his voice smooth yet tinged with irritation. "Do you have any idea who I am?" It wasn't phrased as a question so much as a statement meant to remind Reynolds of the power dynamic between them. To most people, those words might have felt intimidating, perhaps even paralyzing. But Reynolds didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded slowly, locking eyes with the man behind the wheel. "Yes, sir, I do," Reynolds replied evenly. "You're the director of the FBI, but regardless of your position, the law applies equally to everyone. Speeding puts, not only yourself but others at risk. That's why I need to issue this citation." For a moment, neither man said anything. The silence stretched taut, heavy, with unspoken tension. Wray studied Reynolds closely as if trying to gauge whether the officer truly believed what he was saying, or if he could be swayed. Reynolds stood his ground, gripping the clipboard tightly in one hand while keeping the other near his holster. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now, not ever. But then something shifted. Wray leaned back into his seat, exhaling, sharply through his nose. "Look," he said, his tone softer but still laced with frustration. "This is ridiculous. Do you really think giving me a ticket is going to make a difference? I've got important matters to attend to tonight. Can we just move past this?" Reynolds hesitated for a fraction of a second. He understood where Wray was coming from. After all, who wouldn't want to avoid a speeding ticket? But deep down, he knew that bending the rules, no matter how small, the infraction, set a dangerous precedent. If he let Wray off the hook, what message would that send? Would it imply that powerful individuals were above the law? Reynolds shook his head firmly, refusing to budge. "I understand you're busy, sir," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But my responsibility is to ensure safety on these roads, whether you're the FBI director or anyone else. Braking. The law has consequences. This isn't personal, it's procedure." Wray's expression hardened. For someone accustomed to commanding respect and obedience, being told no by a local police officer must have felt foreign and infuriating. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could speak, his hand moved toward the glove compartment of the sedan. It was a subtle gesture, barely noticeable, but Reynolds caught it immediately. In that split second, adrenaline surged through his veins. Years of training kicked in as Reynolds instinctively stepped back, drawing his weapon and pointing it at Wray. "Stop right there," he commanded, his voice louder and sharper than before. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Time seemed to freeze. Wray froze mid-motion, his eyes widening in shock. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising. "This is completely unnecessary." Reynolds' heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay focused. "Sir, please don't make any sudden movements," he said firmly. "I need to ensure my safety and yours. Just keep your hands visible." The situation had escalated far beyond what either man had anticipated. What had started as a routine traffic stop had spiraled into something far more serious. Reynolds' mind raced as he tried to assess the next steps. Should he call for backup? Was Ray reaching for identification, or something else entirely? These questions swirled in his head, but he couldn't afford to second-guess himself. Every decision mattered now. Ray complied reluctantly, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't armed. "This is absurd," he muttered under his breath. "You realize how insane this looks, don't you?" Reynolds ignored the comment, his focus unwavering. "Sir, I'm following protocol," he explained, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. "Please remain calm and cooperate. We'll sort this out together." As the seconds ticked by, the tension grew thicker. Cars continued to pass by on the highway, some drivers slowing down to gawk at the unusual scene. Flashing lights from Reynolds' patrol car illuminated the area, casting long shadows across the pavement. Neither man spoke for a while, each locked in their own thoughts. Reynolds knew he couldn't lower his weapon until he was certain the situation was secure. And Ray, for his part, seemed torn between indignation and disbelief. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Reynolds decided to radio for assistance. He kept his weapon trained on Ray as he spoke into his shoulder mic, requesting backup from nearby units. As he relayed the details of the situation, he couldn't help but wonder how this night would end. Would reinforcements arrive in time to diffuse the tension? Or would things spiral further out of control? Despite the gravity of the moment, Reynolds remained resolute. He reminded himself that he wasn't acting out of malice or ego. He was simply doing his job. No matter how high profile the individual sitting in front of him might be, the principle remained the same. No one was above the law. Even if it meant standing his ground against the director of the FBI, Reynolds knew he couldn't compromise on that belief. And so, as the sound of distant sirens began to echo through the night air, Reynolds took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever came next. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the tense silence that had settled over the highway. Officer Michael Reynolds stood firm, his weapon still trained on Christopher Ray, who remained seated in the driver's seat of the black sedan. The director's face was a mix of frustration and disbelief, his hands raised slightly to show he wasn't reaching for anything. Despite the surreal nature of the moment, Reynolds kept his focus razor sharp. Every second felt like an eternity, but he reminded himself that staying calm was key, not just for his own safety but for everyone involved. As the first backup unit arrived, tires screeching as it pulled onto the shoulder behind Reynolds' patrol car, the scene began to transform. More flashing lights illuminated the area, casting a kaleidoscope of red and blue across the pavement. Two officers stepped out of the vehicle, their hands hovering near their holsters as they assessed the situation. One of them approached cautiously, shouting, "Officer Reynolds, what's going on here?" Reynolds didn't take his eyes off Ray as he responded. "I pulled this vehicle over for speeding," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "When I went to issue the citation, the driver made a sudden movement toward the glove compartment. For my safety, I drew my weapon." The second officer moved closer to the sedan, peering inside at Ray. "Sir, can you identify yourself?" he asked, though something about his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Ray sighed deeply, lowering his hands slightly before catching Reynolds' sharp glare and raising them again. "My name is Christopher Ray," he said, his voice clipped with irritation. "I'm the director of the FBI." If the officers were surprised, they didn't show it immediately. Instead, they exchanged quick glances, clearly weighing the gravity of the situation. Pulling over a high-profile official was one thing, but holding him at gunpoint was another matter entirely. The implications of what was happening began to sink in, not just for the officers on the scene but for everyone watching from afar. Within moments, more vehicles arrived, this time unmarked cars with federal plates. Men and women in suits spilled out, their movements brisk and purposeful. They surrounded the sedan, some drawing weapons while others shouted commands. "Stand down," one agent barked at Reynolds, his voice cutting through the chaos. Lower your weapon immediately. Reynolds hesitated, torn between following orders and maintaining control of the situation. He glanced at the growing crowd of federal agents, then back at Ray, who now looked more annoyed than frightened. "I'm following protocol," Reynolds repeated firmly, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. "Until I know this situation is secure, I can't comply." The standoff intensified as tensions flared on both sides. The federal agents seemed unwilling to back down, their expressions hard and unyielding. Meanwhile, Reynolds's colleagues tried to mediate, urging everyone to de-escalate before things spiraled further out of control. "Everyone needs to calm down," one of the local officers shouted, stepping between Reynolds and the agents. "We're all on the same side here." But the words felt hollow. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It was about power, authority, and the thin line between enforcing the law and overstepping boundaries. Bystanders had begun to gather along the highway, some leaning against guardrails to get a better view. Others recorded the scene on their phones, capturing every detail and uploading it to social media in real time. Within minutes, the confrontation had gone viral, sparking heated debates online. Some praised Reynolds for standing up to authority, while others accused him of recklessness and insubordination. Back on the shoulder of Interstate 66, the situation showed no signs of resolving quickly. Federal agents continued to demand that Reynolds lower his weapon, while he insisted on ensuring the scene was safe before doing so. Ray sat silently in the sedan, his earlier frustration giving way to resignation. It was clear that this night would be remembered for far longer than anyone present could have anticipated. Finally, after what felt like an endless stretch of time, a senior agent stepped forward. He introduced himself as Special Agent Harris and addressed Reynolds directly. "Officer," he said, his tone measured but firm, "we understand your concerns, but we also need you to trust us. We'll handle this from here. Please stand down." Reynolds hesitated once more, his grip tightening on his weapon. He knew that backing down meant relinquishing control of the situation and potentially facing consequences later. Yet he also recognized that escalating further could lead to disaster. After a long pause, he slowly lowered his weapon, keeping it pointed toward the ground. "Understood," he said quietly. "But I want it noted that I acted according to protocol." Special Agent Harris nodded curtly, signaling for his team to secure the area. Two agents approached the sedan, speaking briefly with Ray before escorting him to one of the unmarked cars. As they led him away, Ray shot a final glance at Reynolds, his expression unreadable. Whether it was anger, frustration, or something else entirely, no one could say for sure. With the immediate threat diffused, the atmosphere began to shift. The flashing lights of patrol cars and federal vehicles bathed the highway in an eerie glow, while the hum of conversation filled the air. Local officers huddled together, discussing what had just unfolded, while federal agents conferred among themselves. Reporters, alerted by social media posts, began arriving on the scene, setting up cameras and microphones to capture statements from anyone willing to talk. For Reynolds, the aftermath of the incident hit him like a wave. His hands trembled slightly as he holstered his weapon, the weight of what had happened settling heavily on his shoulders. He had done his job, or at least he believed he had, but the backlash was already beginning to build. Online comments ranged from supportive messages calling him a hero to scathing critiques labeling him reckless. Politicians weighed in, some defending his actions as necessary accountability, while others condemned him for allegedly abusing his authority. As the night wore on, Reynolds found himself replaying the events in his mind. Had he made the right call? Could he have handled the situation differently? These questions swirled in his thoughts, leaving him unsure of how history would judge him. One thing was certain, though. This traffic stop, a seemingly ordinary event, had turned into something extraordinary. And whether it ended in triumph or tragedy, Officer Michael Reynolds knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The chaos on Interstate 66 had reached a fever pitch, with flashing lights illuminating the night like a surreal stage production. The highway, once quiet and unassuming, was now alive with activity. Federal agents, local police officers, reporters, and curious bystanders all converging on the scene. Every car that passed slowed down, drivers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Some even pulled over onto the shoulder, stepping out of their vehicles to get closer. Phones were held high, cameras rolling as people tried to capture every detail of the unfolding drama. Officer Michael Reynolds stood near his patrol car, still processing the whirlwind of events. His heart rate was finally beginning to slow, but his mind raced with questions. What would happen next? How would this moment define him? Around him, federal agents moved with precision, securing the area and speaking in hushed tones into radios. Reporters shouted questions at anyone willing to talk, their microphones thrust forward like weapons. The air buzzed with tension, a mix of confusion, anger, and disbelief rippling through the crowd. As word spread about who had been involved, the FBI director and a local police officer, the story took on a life of its own. Social media erupted, almost instantly. Videos recorded by bystanders went viral within minutes, accompanied by hashtags like "Our Justice for Reynolds" and "Accountability Matters." Supporters praised Reynolds for standing up to power, calling him a symbol of integrity in a world where authority often seemed untouchable. Critics, however, painted him as reckless and insubordinate, accusing him of letting his ego override common sense. Comment sections became battlegrounds, with strangers passionately debating whether Reynolds was a hero or a villain. Amidst the noise, Special Agent Harris approached Reynolds, his expression unreadable. "We're going to need your full cooperation moving forward," he said firmly, though not unkindly. "This situation is complicated." Reynolds nodded, though he bristled slightly at the implication that he'd done something wrong. "I've already explained everything," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm swirling around him. "I followed protocol. If there's an issue, it's not because I acted recklessly." Harris studied him for a moment before nodding curtly. "We'll see," he said simply, then turned and walked back toward the group of federal agents. Reynolds watched him go, feeling a gnawing sense of unease. He knew that being cooperative didn't guarantee a favorable outcome. In fact, given the circumstances, he couldn't shake the feeling that he might be walking into a trap. Meanwhile, Christopher Wray had been escorted to one of the unmarked cars parked nearby. Through tinted windows he sat silently, his expression unreadable. To those watching from afar, it was impossible to tell whether he was angry, embarrassed, or simply tired. But inside, Ray's mind churned with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he understood why Reynolds had drawn his weapon. It was standard procedure when someone made a sudden movement during a traffic stop. On the other hand, the sheer audacity of having a local officer hold him at gunpoint rankled deeply. It wasn't just about pride, it was about the optics. As the head of the FBI, Ray represented law enforcement at its highest level. Being treated like any other citizen, even if justified, felt like a blow to his authority. Back at the center of the commotion, reporters continued to press for answers. A young journalist from a local news station managed to corner one of the federal agents guarding the perimeter. "Can you confirm that Director Wray was pulled over tonight?" she asked eagerly, her microphone inches from the agent's face. The agent hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "All I can say is that we're investigating an incident involving a traffic stop," he replied evasively. "Beyond that, I'm not authorized to comment." The reporter wasn't satisfied but didn't push further. Instead, she turned to the growing crowd of bystanders hoping to gather first-hand accounts. One man, wearing a baseball cap and holding a phone, stepped forward enthusiastically. "I saw the whole thing," he declared, pointing toward the sedan. "That cop, he had no choice but to pull out his gun. The dude in the fancy suit looked like he was reaching for something." Another bystander chimed in, shaking her head. "It's ridiculous," she said. "Why are they making such a big deal out of a speeding ticket? Just give the guy a ticket and let him go." The differing opinions reflected the broader public reaction. Online forums lit up with heated discussions, memes mocking both sides of the argument flooding social media feeds. Late-night comedians seized on the story, turning it into fodder for jokes. Meanwhile, politicians weighed in, eager to stake their claim on either side of the debate. Some praised Reynolds as a champion of accountability, while others called for an immediate investigation into his conduct. For Reynolds, the attention was overwhelming. As he answered questions from his superiors and gave a brief statement to investigators, he couldn't help but notice how quickly the narrative shifted, depending on who was telling the story. To some, he was a brave officer doing his duty without fear or favor. To others, he was a loose cannon whose actions risked undermining trust in law enforcement. The weight of these perceptions bore down on him, leaving him unsure of how history would judge him. By the time the scene began to clear, the sun was starting to rise, casting a pale golden light over the horizon. The highway slowly returned to normal, with cars speeding past as if nothing unusual had happened. But for Reynolds, the night felt far from over. As he climbed back into his patrol car, exhausted and emotionally drained, he realized that the true consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. The coming days and possibly weeks would determine whether he'd be hailed as a hero or condemned as a cautionary tale. Either way, Officer Michael Reynolds knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. By morning, the incident on Interstate 66 had exploded into a national sensation. Headlines blared across newspapers and digital platforms, each one more dramatic than the last. "Local cop holds FBI director at gunpoint," screamed one tabloid, while another asked, "Hero or hothead?" the officer who stood up to power. Social media feeds were flooded with memes, opinions, and debates, turning what had started as a routine traffic stop into a cultural flashpoint. For many Americans, it wasn't just about the events themselves, it was about what they represented. Accountability versus authority, individual courage versus institutional power. As Officer Michael Reynolds arrived at the police station early, that day he could already feel the weight of the scrutiny bearing down on him. Reporters camped outside the building, microphones in hand, shouting questions as he walked through the doors. "Officer Reynolds, did you overstep your bounds?" One called out. "Do you regret drawing your weapon?" asked another. Reynolds kept his head down, avoiding eye contact as he made his way inside. He knew better than to say anything without consulting his department's public relations team first, but even behind closed doors, the pressure didn't let up. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. Fellow officers greeted him with a mix of admiration and concern. Some patted him on the back, whispering words of support. "You did the right thing," one veteran cop told him earnestly. Others, however, gave him wary looks, clearly worried about the potential fallout for the department. No one wanted to be associated with controversy, not when careers and reputations were on the line. Reynolds' commanding officer, Captain Laura Hayes, called him into her office for an emergency meeting. She was a no-nonsense leader who valued discipline above all else. But there was a hint of unease in her eyes as she motioned for Reynolds to sit down. "Michael," she began, leaning forward across her desk, "I need you to understand something. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about this entire department, and how we're perceived by the public." Reynolds nodded, though his jaw tightened slightly. "I get it, Captain," he said, "but I followed protocol. If I hadn't drawn my weapon when I thought Director Ray might be reaching for something, people would have criticized me for not taking precautions." Hayes sighed, rubbing her temples. "That may be true," she admitted. "But perception is everything in situations like this. People don't always care about the technicalities. They care about the optics. And right now, the optics aren't great." The conversation shifted to damage control. Hayes explained that internal investigators were already reviewing Reynolds' actions, while federal authorities conducted their own inquiry. Both sides were looking for answers, and someone to hold accountable. Meanwhile, protests had erupted outside the station, with supporters rallying under banners that read, "No one is above the law," and "Justice for Reynolds." Counter-protesters weren't far behind, holding signs that accused Reynolds of abusing his power and endangering lives. The division in public opinion spilled over into political arenas as well. Lawmakers took to podiums and TV studios, eager to weigh in on the controversy. Senator James Caldwell, known for his tough-on-crime stance, praised Reynolds during a press conference. "This officer stood up for the rule of law," Caldwell declared. "He reminded us that no one, not even the head of the FBI, is above accountability. We should commend him for his bravery." On the other side of the aisle, Representative Lisa Martinez condemned the incident, calling it reckless and unnecessary. "While I believe in holding everyone accountable, including government officials, we must also recognize the dangers of escalating routine situations," she argued. "Drawing a weapon on the FBI director sets a dangerous precedent and undermines trust between law enforcement agencies." The debate raged on, fueled by pundits and commentators who dissected every detail of the encounter. Talk shows invited legal experts to analyze whether Reynolds had acted within his rights, while late-night hosts joked about the absurdity of the situation. Memes circulated widely, some poking fun at Ray for getting pulled over, others mocking Reynolds for daring to challenge such a high-profile figure. Amidst the noise, the story became less about the facts and more about the broader themes it touched upon: fairness, privilege, and the fragile balance of power in society. For Reynolds, navigating this whirlwind proved exhausting. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, family, and strangers alike. Some offered encouragement, thanking him for standing up to authority. Others sent harsh criticism, accusing him of grandstanding or seeking attention. Each message added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. At times, he wondered if he'd made the wrong decision, if perhaps he should have found a way to de-escalate without drawing his weapon. But deep down, he believed he'd done what any responsible officer would do under the circumstances. The protests outside the station grew larger as the day wore on. Supporters chanted slogans like "Equal Justice for All" and "Stand with Reynolds," their voices echoing off the walls of nearby buildings. Many carried American flags symbolizing their belief in the principles of fairness and equality. Across the street, counter-protesters held opposing signs arguing that Reynolds' actions had endangered lives and disrespected the chain of command. Tensions occasionally flared between the two groups, prompting local police to increase their presence to maintain order. Despite the chaos swirling around him, Reynolds tried to focus on his job. He reported for duty as usual, patrolling the streets and responding to calls. But everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some approached him with gratitude, shaking his hand or offering kind words. Others glared at him, muttering under their breath about arrogance and recklessness. Even simple tasks, like stopping at a coffee shop or filling up his patrol car with gas, felt surreal, as if he were living in a fishbowl with the entire world watching his every move. By evening, the stress had taken its toll. Reynolds returned home to find reporters lingering near his driveway, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. He ignored them, retreating indoors and locking the door behind him. Sitting alone in his dimly lit living room, he replayed the events of the past 24 hours in his mind. Had he truly done the right thing? Or had he let pride cloud his judgment? These questions haunted him, leaving him restless and unsure. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Reynolds realized that the coming days would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The spotlight wasn't going to fade anytime soon. In fact, it might grow brighter as investigations continued and public interest intensified. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. His actions had ignited a firestorm of debate about justice, authority, and the limits of power. Whether he emerged as a hero or a cautionary tale remained to be seen. But either way, the ripple effects of that fateful night would shape conversations for years to come.